Kate Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. This is video number 4 of our Saturday book, A Talent to Deceive, The Search for the Real Killer of the Lindbergh Baby by William Norris. And this is, oh, what a tangled web. What a story. I'm just going to proceed. And if you're just coming into this here, this is the 4th video, so you're going to want to go back. And last week we did 1 and 2, and this week 3 and 4. 4 might be lengthy, so let's get to work. Chapter 19, World Champion Liars. After 4.5 hours, the grand jury handed down an indictment for murder. Bruno was extradited to New Jersey. His lawyer, Fawcett, absolutely believed in his innocence and did a writ of habeas corpus. He had proof that Bruno was not there. There was nothing to show he was there, and there was proof that he was not there. He had timesheets. They finally got the right timesheets and payroll records and eyewitnesses, but the DA got to them first, this evidence, gave it to the cops, and so they just sort of disappeared mysteriously. They were locked in a safe that belonged to the assistant DA. The timesheets, the pay stubs, the testimony of these witnesses. The writ was not granted. Fawcett, the lawyer, tried to stay extradition for an appeal to be filed, but that didn't happen. Reporter Tom Cassidy found the employment agency who had gotten Bruno the job on March 1st and confirmed it. They had records of hiring him for March 1st and the name of a co-worker who worked with Hauptmann on the job, but the judge refused to look at the evidence because it conflicted with other evidence, so throw it out. Bruno was taken to New Jersey, and he pled not guilty. Meanwhile, the prosecution found the co-worker who had worked with Hauptmann and coerced him into an affidavit that Bruno was not working March 1st. They strong-arm people. The guy from the employment agency mysteriously wrote a new statement. Then the copies of the agency documents all completely disappeared. Well, the Morrows and the Lindberghs expressed relief about this. Chapter 20, bolstering a shoddy case. Bruno was kept in a tiny cell, not let out ever. He got no sleep. They kept waking him up. He had no conversations with anybody, essentially. He was in solitary. They searched his cell 30 times a day just to harass him. He was not allowed visitors. They subjected him to a full physical exam every day. And this just felt like there was no case. Let me refer to this. Where did I go with this? Okay, there's a lengthy description in the book of the harassment that he received. I won't even go into it. Clarence Darrow, a very, very famous criminal attorney, gave an interview and said, "I haven't seen anything here to indicate murder, have you? Just the fact that Hauptmann had the ransom money doesn't prove he had anything to do with it." But, Hauptmann was not his lawyer, and then he lost his lawyer, James Fawcett, and he had done a good job for him up to that time. But then he got this new lawyer, Riley, who was called Death House Riley because of his losing record in homicide cases. And he spent the last 2 years of his life in an insane asylum with tertiary syphilis and died of a stroke in 1940. He was pompous, an exhibitionist, loved to be the center of attention, and his fees were paid by the Hearst newspapers. He made no secret of the fact that Lindbergh was one of his heroes. But he admitted that one of the special agents had told him. Now, this is his new lawyer. Lindbergh's new lawyer was told by one of the special agents that he knew that Bruno was guilty, that he didn't like him, and he was anxious to see him get the chair. So these are the people that are helping him. Where are we here? So Fawcett quit, and the new attorney was this awful alcoholic guy. Fancy outfits, pompous exhibitionist, getting paid by Hearst. Lindbergh was his hero. He was talking with agents, and they were sharing how they didn't like Bruno. So even his own lawyer, you know. Anna couldn't afford a good lawyer, and she'd been pressured by Hearst to take on this Riley guy. But he wasn't allowed, Bruno was not allowed to sell his stocks, so he couldn't make any money to raise to pay a good lawyer. They charged him $14 for a package of cigarettes. And he finally agreed to give an interview. Anna agreed to give an interview to the Hearst papers in exchange for room and board and money for the attorney because she was completely broken. Fawcett was furious about this whole situation, but he knew he'd been pushed out, and he knew that Hearst was about it for the story, right? And he refused to send the case files to Riley the drunk until Anna paid his $4,000 bill. So Hearst gave her the money to pay the bill so that the original lawyer had no choice but to pass on the files. Bruno's first visitor in jail was Jaffe Condon. And he was a crucial prosecution eyewitness to Cemetery John, but despite the fact that his story was so important to the prosecution, he still was not willing to ID Bruno. It's weird that they let him go in and talk to him. The New York cops cornered Condon and threatened to arrest him if he refused to ID Bruno. They said, "We'll arrest you for receiving part of the ransom money." There was no evidence to support this, but we now know that evidence is irrelevant in this case. But his wife was so close to a breakdown about the whole thing, the uncertainty of it. Also, he considered Lindbergh a hero, so he wasn't going to argue with Lindbergh, who said he heard Bruno. So he said, okay. He said he'd ID Bruno if they kept it out of the public, and if they would let him go visit Bruno and try to get Bruno to confess, which is why they let him visit, but it's very, very unusual. The Attorney General in Schwarzkopf did not trust Condon, so they went with him to the jail. Condon tried to get Bruno to say that they'd met before. Bruno insisted he had no idea who Condon was and he had not been involved in the kidnapping. Condon jumped up and said, "I will not testify against this man." Whoa. And the Attorney General, Lentz, was very angry with Condon. Bruno finally was given books and magazines and newspapers with articles about him removed. Anna was allowed to visit behind a screen. They couldn't kiss, they couldn't touch, and they were spied on. But they never, when he met with his wife, they never incriminated him in their conversation. Riley, his lawyer, his new lawyer, spent a total of 38 minutes with him in 3 months, 38 minutes in all, before the trial, and while he was there, he was drunk. There was another defense attorney who worked with Riley called C.L. Fisker. He was more serious, and he went twice a week. He was convinced that Bruno was innocent. 2 other attorneys were too, Rosencrantz and Pope. Kind of epic names if you think about it. They were not getting paid by Hearst. They were paid by Bruno, who was going broke, there was no money for expert witnesses for the defense. The prosecution, meanwhile, had unlimited money from Hearst. For example, the prosecution had 8 different handwriting experts, and they said whatever Hearst would pay for. And just the price of the prosecution's handwriting experts was more money than the entire defense of the case for the defense. Money spent. Bruno's lawyers were not allowed to go to his apartment to check out, the scene of ostensibly the scene of where things were hidden and everything. They were never allowed to look at the ladder. They were never allowed to see the ransom notes. These are his defense lawyers. Whatever happened to that rule, disclosure, where they're supposed to, I don't think that's the right term, but they're supposed to give all of the evidence to both sides. So the defense witnesses didn't get to visit him, but the prosecution witnesses could visit him as often as they wanted. So weird. His best friend Hans was to testify about Fish seeing him give Bruno the box. And he says that before he talked to the grand jury, the detectives, or the DA's men, took me into a private room and started talking about what electricity does to the body, all the terrible things that happen to a man who was electrocuted. They were trying to scare me with the electric chair so that I would not testify, and they threatened to put me in prison. But I testified anyway. Tried to make him an accomplice, They grilled him for 3 days. He still testified in favor of his friend Bruno. The only prosecution eyewitness to Bruno being at Hopewell, which he wasn't, but the only one who said he was Whithead, the poor guy that was happy to take the money, $150 a day to testify. Totally an unreliable liar. They needed somebody a little bit more solid. They found an 87-year-old who claimed he saw a car with a ladder come to Hopewell. He'd been bragging to his friends, and the cops got wind of it and searched for him. This guy had cataracts, was almost completely blind, and was a known welfare cheat. But he was promised $25,000 of the reward if he would ID Bruno. His family that he'd been visiting said, this whole story is news to us. So they made him a witness for the prosecution. And then they got a third witness, a cashier at the cinema, who a year earlier said she'd been given $5 of the ransom money, that the guy was an American and had no accent. And this was supposed to have happened, allegedly, according to her original testimony. The guy was American, no accent, and it happened on a day that was Bruno's birthday, where there was a birthday party being thrown for him, that he was there the entire time, 15 miles away. Chapter 21, a return to the Morrow hypotheses. Once Bruno was arrested, the investigation ended. No search went on for the rest of the gold certificates, which is too bad. The travel agent, George Steinweg, still had notes for his wife, and he could have ID'd Fisher and would have been able to be an eyewitness to Bruno's credibility, but they didn't. They ended the search. They never found out about this guy until much later. There was no investigation of the involvement of the illegitimate Morrow son. This could have been confirmed by the widow, Elizabeth, if she told the truth under oath. The lawyer who'd been overheard talking about it, he could have testified. Lindbergh could have. Condon could have. Nobody was questioned about it. His name didn't even come up. The author deduced the author deduced by the time frame, if you lay it out, the chronology of it, that who the servants were, where they were, and who said what to whom, that it's likely that there might have been more involved. In 1910, the census lists the Morrow servants, and it lists Morrow's money, which would make him the equivalent of a multimillionaire today. He lived in a big house with 3 servants. Matter, there's a name for you, who was 36. The governess to Dwight Jr., Elizabeth, and Anne. Elizabeth and Anne are 2 more servants. But very strict and not likely. She went with the family to Europe in 1911. She took the children alone with her to Germany, and Dwight and his wife went off by themselves without their children for 6 weeks. Then he returned by himself to the United States in June, and his wife, Elizabeth, met up with the children and the nanny who were in Germany, and they didn't come back until October. So Dwight spent June, July, August, September, and most of October by himself back home. And he spent most of that time living at his various country clubs. And then there was an opportunity. So, we're talking about the provenance of this illegitimate child. So he did have more of an opportunity to fool around. 2 years earlier, the wife took the children to Colorado. He was home alone with Bessie Atkins and Susan McCabe, servants, both of them 24 years old. So, and Bessie was African American, so it wasn't her, because this son had been seen, and it just didn't appear like he had African American blood. I mean, I suppose he could have, but much more likely that it was Susan who was Irish, because he looked more like that. By 1920, he was living in a different house. The Morrows were living in a different house. So the question is, the truthfulness of him having an affair, is that even possible? So if you look back on his life, he dated his wife for 8 years. Then they were engaged for 2 years. It seems there was no passion in their relationship, and that the way they delicately put it, he had some difficulty with intimacy. The whole image of them having this perfect society marriage was a gigantic sham, in basically the same way that Lindbergh and Anne, Dwight Morrow's daughter, married to Lindbergh. Their marriage was supposedly the perfect marriage, and it was a gigantic sham. Morrow was leading a double life for at least 17 years. He had an affair with 2 children with somebody called Velasca, a private secretary. In 1957, he had an affair with somebody called Kent, who was 55. He had, I read that wrong. He pretended to be a guy called Kent, 55. He had an affair with Brigitte Hessemer, who was 32, in Munich, and had an affair with her until her death, and they had 3 children. Oh, I'm sorry, you know what? I should probably review some of my notes before I try to do this summary, because when I said Lindbergh and Anne had a sham of a marriage, it wasn't a perfect marriage, this information is actually about them. This is Lindbergh, not Dwight we're talking about. Dwight had affairs with the maids. Lindbergh, it was even worse, really, when you think about it. So go back, and they had a very passionless relationship, but they were married for a very long time. He had an affair that lasted 17 years with a private secretary. He dated a woman called Brigitte Heisemann in Munich. They had an affair until his death. They had 3 children. The 3 children knew who their father was from the 1980s on. They were sworn to secrecy until the mother died in 1999. And they found 112 love letters between Lindbergh and this woman, longtime affair in Munich. 112 love letters that have been seen now by public people. At the same time that he was having that relationship and 3 children with a woman in Munich and married to Anne back home, he had an affair with Brigitte's sister, Marietta, and had 2 sons. So he was stooping 2 different sisters in Germany. Brigitte and Marietta. He had 3 kids with one sister, 2 kids with the other sister, and oh yeah, FYI, a wife back home. With Anne, he had 6 children, so he had total somewhere between 11 and 13 children. It's not entirely clear. Anne had an affair in 1956 with her psychotherapist for several years, or psychiatrist for several years. Were they aware of each other's affairs? Watch the channeling of the Lindbergh case and you'll find out. I know. You watch it. The children of Brigitte were DNA matched to him, and they did not bother to make a claim on the estate. That's not what they were about. And this is what they had to say. The son, Dirk, who was 45, said, "We didn't have the time together with him that other children have, but when he was here, he focused on us. He was a really great father. I got attention from him, more than others get from their fathers who are around all the time." His daughter Astrid says, "Deep down, everyone wants to know who their father was. My mother was totally happy when he came. To me, he was my father. To others, he was Charles Lindbergh. It seemed perfectly natural that he came for a time and then left again." So he put money in trust for all these children, secretly. He had a talent for deception. This sort of shows a ghost's character, I think. He deceived his wife about this for 17 years. He deceived his legitimate children. He deceived the world. Even a biographer that won the National Book Award and wrote about his life never found out about it. He accused Brigitte of being crazy when she came out and talked about it, but then DNA proved that she was telling the truth and Lindbergh was lying. So it's believable that he could lie to protect a kidnapper if family scandal occurred. They asked John Slocum of Craig House, the guy that helped to run the sanitarium, and he said that yes, the illegitimate son had escaped, but we won't tell you what his name is because of patient confidentiality. There is documentary proof. The author was told by this guy from the clinic. He told the author, think college. So some sort of documentation having to do with the school. And he went to Amherst. Chapter 22, One Rumor Hard to Rest. So 2 universities are associated with the Murrows. Amherst, the alma mater of Dwight Sr., and Smith both have collections of Morrow correspondence. Morrow left both about $200,000 each. Some of the letters, correspondence at Amherst are okay for the public to look at, and some are not seen by the public. The family gets to okay anything that's looked at. The author got permission to look at some of this stuff. He found a letter from a John W. Morrow to Dwight's personal secretary, asking if he could see Springer, the personal secretary, and claiming he'd been mugged and needed more money. Who was John Morrow? Was this the illegitimate son, is the question. There were rumors that the illegitimate son's name was John. So there were letters missing from the file between 1921 and 1931. This would have been the time, the files at the colleges, this would have been the time that this illegitimate child was still a kid. The keeper of the files at Amherst was incensed and offended that the author would imply that things had been misfiled or lost. Then they found a letter in public files from the YMCA to Springer before Dwight's death, and the letter seemed to indicate that the writer was a former Army person and in some sort of hospital care, implying mental care. But if John were in World War II, Dwight would have been 25 in law school. So what war trauma would he have suffered? Might it have been Korea? I don't know. Vietnam? Hard to say. This guy was not married. There were no servants to ask, but it could still be his kid. But the author eventually discovered that this John that they thought they were looking at, there is a person named John that they thought that they were looking at, that he was born in 1884, and if that's true, Dwight would have only been 11 years old. So, ergo, this is not the illegitimate son. This is somebody else who's torturing Dwight for money. It turns out he was the son of a judge who had the name of Murrow, but it was a different Murrow family. They weren't related. The judge had been a controversial figure in political things. He was accused of embezzling. And his will left money to his son John in a trust for his care to be administered by his sister because he wasn't capable. He had been in the military. This is this other John, not related to Lindbergh. He was in the military hospital in 1920, so it must have been World War I, and a neuropsychiatric patient in 1930. Did he have shell shock, PTSD? He would have been too old to be Dwight's illegitimate son, but he did have mental illness like Dwight's son, and he was deluded. Part of his mental illness was he was related to Dwight Murrow and Charles Lindbergh. He was impoverished. They did find more letters from him at Amherst to Dwight complaining about veterans services. This Secretary Springer told him to go talk to the Army Relief Society. Don't bother Dwight Murrow. And there's just one weird reply about this judge's estate. Springer met with him. The secretary met with him. And he later regretted it because what it did was it increased this character's delusions. So what you've got is a mentally ill person who just coincidentally has the same last name as the Murrows. And he has developed this delusion that he's related to Senator Dwight Murrow. He's not. But he keeps writing and asking for money. And it's very confusing because Dwight Murrow had a secret illegitimate son for whom he was providing money. So you can see why this was very confusing, and people all over the place were lying about everything. So you didn't know what to believe. It was hard to get any kind of evidence. It was intentionally hidden. What a mess the story is. Anyway, the secretary regretted because he was stoking the delusions of this guy rather than getting rid of him. Then this guy, John Murrow, wrote a letter of condolence at the loss of the baby to Lindbergh and Anne. His next letter was really weird, going on. I mean, the letter went on for pages about his lack of money and his trouble with the Veterans Affairs. It was delusional. Next, he wrote to Elizabeth, Dwight Murrow's widow, Lindbergh's mother-in-law, and the secretary, they have a copy of a letter from the secretary telling Elizabeth to ignore this guy. He's nuts. Next letter to Springer was really long and really even more nuts, and always now commenting on Lindbergh's second son. So this got people scared. Now he's talking about not only the loss of the first child, but now he's obsessed with Master Johnny, as he calls him. Then he wrote a letter to Elizabeth mentioning extended family members and servants, kind of like he had intimate knowledge of all these people. And when the Veterans Affair under Roosevelt gave him more than $500, he started writing to Springer for investment advice. The whole correspondence between this delusional man and the Murrow family was just unwell and sad. Chapter 23, the Hauptmann trial. The prosecution secretly investigated potential jurors from a list of 150 and rated them good, fair, or poor. They had a network of paid informers. They paid off the judge, and all of this is not alleged. All of this has been shown much later to be true. see what I've got here. Oh, I remember this. How to be a good juror on the Bruno Hauptmann trial, according to the prosecution. Be American, a believer in capital punishment, unfriendly to Fisher, that's the earlier lawyer, have a relative in the state police, do jury duty before that resulted in a conviction. And Willens, the AG, thought these were the ones that he'd be most likely to pick. So in the days before psychologists investigated juries, these were their criteria. Lindbergh spent long hours with the prosecution and looking at the evidence, which is odd, very odd. And he was determined for a conviction. And said he would do anything for a conviction of Bruno. The trial was held at the Flemington Courthouse, a sleepy town. It was invaded by the media, by celebrities and spectators. It had a population of 3,000 that doubled overnight. Mencken, H.L. Mencken, who's hilarious, called it the greatest story since the resurrection. And Bruno seemed confident. He didn't seem worried because he said he believed in the justice system, and I'm innocent. He didn't realize that no jury was ever going to dare acquit him. So the courtroom, which was intended for 200, held 500, 300 of whom were reporters, and a lot of celebrity writers were there too. This is, entertainment Hollywood type stuff. Edna Ferber was there. We sit and stare like vultures on a tree. We're like the knitting women watching the heads fall at the foot of the guillotine. It's a reference to A Tale of Two Cities. We have got into the room through cajolery, bribery, trickery, and lies. Madame Defarge, Where am I here? So, on days when there was no trial, they gave guided tours of the courtroom. The first Sunday, when there was no trial, 60,000 people in 20,000 cars came for a tour. Vendors set up, it was like a 3-ring circus. Vendors sold toy ladders, forged, signed pictures of Lindbergh, locks of the baby's hair. This is really bad. Oh, wow. The reporters, there were like 5,000 to 10,000 reporters in a day. Judge Trenchard was 71. He'd served on the New Jersey Supreme Court for 28 years. He had presided over 91 murder trials and 11 death sentences. It took them 2 days to find 12 jurors, 8 men and 4 women. They were paid $3 a day. They had to share rooms. They were sequestered. No paper, no radio. They were like kept in a boarding house. They were escorted on walks. They weren't even, this is horrifying for the public at the time, and they weren't allowed to go to church. The opening statements focused on there was one kidnapping, not a gang, no extra footprints, no lookouts at the cemetery, no association of John. This was just Bruno Hauptmann, plain and simple. They claimed these eyewitnesses had seen him at Hopewell. Never mind, one was blind and one was a paid liar. They claimed that the baby was killed in a fall when the ladder broke, but there's no evidence of any of this. They claim Bruno ripped up the floorboard from the attic and sanded it down, planed it down to make it smaller to make the ladder. And the question is, why would he, a really gifted carpenter, build such a cruddy ladder out of wood from an attic when he had all kinds of good wood and the ability to build a decent ladder? It made no sense. They accused Bruno of buying a boat, sweepstake tickets, and gambling with the gold certificates. There's absolutely no evidence of any of this whatsoever. Anne testified. She was sympathetic. This is Anne Lindbergh testified. She was very sympathetic. She talked about Lindbergh having a gun under his coat. he testified at the trial about the voice at the cemetery and said that it was Bruno. There were no questions from Riley, the drunk lawyer, because Lindbergh was his hero. The defense even got Lindbergh to say that he believed that it was Bruno and he was betrayed by his own lawyer. They cross-examined Lindbergh on the stand and got Lindbergh to say, "Oh yeah, it was your client." Chapter 24, prosecution mired in lies. The defense was useless. They had no challenge to anything. They had a trooper on the stand who changed his story from 2 sets of footprints to 1 set of footprints, and the print didn't match to the print did match. They never challenged him. They never challenged eyewitnesses to a car with a man and a ladder seen that day. They never challenged him about his bad vision. They never challenged the other guy about being paid. They never asked to explain about discrepancies in their descriptions. He had described the man as having a round red face, and Hoffman was a real pale guy. And they talked about a green car. Bruno's car was blue. There was no test of vision of anyone on the stand. But later, when Governor Hoffman looked into it, this guy failed a vision test. No ladder was allowed to be examined, even though it had been taken apart and rebuilt by investigators 3 different times without a chain of custody. No proof of association of any part of it with Bruno. When the judge agreed that they needed to make a connection, the prosecution had this bogus attic floorboard story. The taxi driver was given a note by a man that he couldn't ID, couldn't describe now, but then he went and ID'd Bruno, and Bruno, in the middle of the court, when the taxi driver ID'd him, he said, "You're a liar," because he was lying. Jaffe Condon changed his mind and testified and perjured himself. Now he had a new description of Cemetery John, looked astoundingly like Bruno. They also added to the conversation that he'd had with John, using the testimony of other people to augment his own conversation. And he talked about things only the kidnapper would have known, like safety pins on the cot. But there's no legitimacy to the source of any of this because he had access to written evidence and testimony of others and, the whole thing. Riley, for the defense, cross-examined Condon and could not deal with Condon's verbal diarrhea. He puts it this way: he was drowned in a nonsensical torrent. Condon reinforced Lindbergh's testimony. Bruno was in despair. He expected Condon to say what he'd said to him in his jail cell. Condon had said, "I can't testify against this man," and that's what Bruno expected, but he went against it. The police confirmed that the writing tests said it was Bruno, but they neglected to say how that whole thing of testing Bruno's handwriting unfolded, spelling things out for him to get the wrong spelling included in the sample, and just the authorship was so questionable. The 8 experts for the prosecution swore that it was Bruno. It took them 4 days, getting hiccups, 4 days to get the evidence of all the handwriting experts for the prosecution. And one of them said, "Well, I'm just sort of going on faith on this." Many said that Bruno lived high on $50,000 ransom, but it was very false. He did freelance carpentry. Many said that after the kidnapping, he never worked again. This was also false. He was just a shrewd investor, too. An agent from the Treasury manufactured a budget to make him look guilty. After the fact, created a budget that Hoffman had never had. The unemployment agency guy with the written records started the truth, tried to provide the truth, but then went back on it later. And the defense never looked at the actual timesheets from the employment agency. So keep in mind, there's two sources of timesheets. There's the record kept by the employment agency, and then there's the record kept by the employer that he did carpentry for. Chapter 25, evidence built to suit the crime. There were many, many lies. People were bribed, cajoled, pressured, threatened. Some witnesses just wanted to be in the famous trial, and it was all orchestrated by the Attorney General, Willents. He knew that this evidence was false, that the witnesses were suborned. It was lie after lie. There was no evidence at all that Bruno Hoffman was at the scene, no footprints, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses that he was really there that weren't getting paid or couldn't see. It all was dependent on this ladder and the attic floorboard, which was fake evidence. There was an early report of the first searches of the attic that there was nothing of value. The floor was intact. It was even mentioned that the floor was intact. And this report was never shown to the jury. The cop who took the stand about the floorboard 100% lied. The defense lawyers were never allowed in the apartment to investigate. The wood expert lied. He did an earlier testimony of the pieces of the ladder where he said this is just bogus, and he gave all the reasons as a wood expert this whole thing was bogus, but then he agreed to take the stand and changed his testimony. A chisel was found in the possession of the New Jersey police 40 years after this trial. And it proved that what the wood expert said was a lie. Something to do with the creation of the ladder was a lie. March 24th, 1936, he's been found guilty, and this is a couple of days before the execution. The governor and the defense were finally let into the apartment, and Governor Hoffman said that visit was very revealing. Examination of the attic floor proved that the lie about the wood from the attic was a lie. It had to do with the shape of the nail holes and the quality of the wood and that kind of thing. It proved that the evidence given on the stand about this wood from the expert was a lie. There was a circus going on, meanwhile, outside the court. The defense attorney, Riley, got drunk one night and danced around a flagpole in front of the media and the crowd. Ferber called it an affront to civilization. Chapter 26, I know that I am innocent. The defense asked to dismiss the case because the evidence there was no evidence. No evidence of what happened to the baby, where it was killed, not even which county it died in. There was no evidence that Bruno was at the scene, but the judge just denied everything. Fisher, the assistant attorney, opened for the defense, and he said, we'll prove that Bruno's alibi for murder and the ransom note was legitimate, that he had alibis, and we'll prove that his finances had nothing to do with the ransom money, and we're going to discredit many of the witnesses with real facts. Bruno was the first witness for the defense. He described his arrest, the beatings, his mistreatment, the attempts to get a confession beaten out of him. He dismissed the amateur ladder by saying, I'm a carpenter. Look at this. The prosecution got him to admit to lying about having committed crimes in Germany. He was mocked and bullied. The prosecution said, you think you're a big shot. You're having fun. You think you're bigger than everyone else. They said this to Bruno while he was on the stand. This was like two kids in a playground bullying each other. It got so bad that Bruno actually yelled at the prosecution to stop. He admitted he lied about the gold certificates because he knew that they were illegal. And he spent 17 hours on the stand, and 11 hours of it was being cross-examined. The New York Times he seemed more strong and more composed by the end. There was 100% proof that he was telling the truth in his work records. They had the timesheets. They did not put that evidence out there, and other witnesses who saw Hauptmann both at work that day and the next day were never called to testify. In 1997, a 79-year-old German woman came forward. She was a European handwriting expert, and she was given the okay to look at the ransom notes and to look at Bruno's dictation writing when he was in jail. And she said that the original ransom note had obviously been tampered with. Different ink had been written over the original to make it look more like Hoffman's writing. And she told Riley that she could prove that Bruno was innocent in 5 minutes. Riley was mad at her and ordered her to go home. And she came forward, in 1997 to tell this story. He scared her so that she hid the night he sent her home and left town the next day in disguise. And she said it was really apparent that even Bruno's lawyer didn't want the truth to come out. Anna, his wife, testified after Bruno. The New York Times asked in their article, apparently the New York Times stays true to form, and asked how long should a woman stick by a man? How far should wifely loyalty carry her? The author of the book spoke with Anna Hauptmann 50 years later. 50 years later, she was still convinced of his innocence. She was a calm, frightened witness. She never saw the box of money. She said she didn't even know that was up there, that she was too short to even see that shelf properly in that closet. Riley made no use of the testimony of Fish, the con man, of his friends. They were ready to testify that he had bought a lot of what they called hot money. The defense witnesses were not called because Bruno couldn't pay for them to travel. And there was interference by the New Jersey State Police with other. Some were sent home without being put on the stand as not needed. Hans, the friend, gave testimony. He was called to the district attorney's hotel room the night before and said, if you say on the witness chair that you saw Fish with the shoebox, you'll be arrested right away. I was surprised he said that. This is Hans speaking. I told the Attorney General, I seen it. I seen him come into the house with the shoebox. It's the truth. And he said if I talk about the shoebox, I'm going to be in a lot of trouble. Then a day or so later, I think it was the day before I testified, there was a story in the newspaper that police were about to arrest a second man in the kidnapping. That was me they were talking about. They were trying to scare me so I would shut up, and I was scared. So when I testified, I never called it a shoebox. I described the size. I gave the measurements. But I never used the word shoebox. That was his way of ameliorating the threat to him. And, this is witness tampering. What do you think? So the leftover defense witnesses seemed frivolous. The ones that were left were useless. They had criminal histories. They had histories of mental illness. 2 guys did testify that Bruno was at the bakery with Anna March 1st at night for dinner. Bruno didn't know who they were. They were people that just happened to be there and saw them there. One spoke to Bruno, and this is interesting. The baker had a German Shepherd, and when Bruno came for dinner, while dinner was getting ready, the baker asked Bruno to walk his German Shepherd. So he did. And he was approached on this walk by a guy who was looking for a lost German Shepherd. Just a weird coincidence. And said, hey, you've got my German Shepherd. And Bruno said, no, this belongs to the baker. It's my friend the baker. I'm walking his dog for him while he's making my dinner. And come with me to the baker's and we'll verify it. So the man hunting for the lost dog went with Lindbergh back to the bakery and realized, oh, okay, you're right. Sorry, not my dog. But he did remember this entire conversation and was willing to testify. Another guy was a customer, and he heard the story between Lindbergh, the baker, and the lost dog guy, when they came into the bakery after the walk, he was a customer sitting there. He heard the entire exchange. He's an eyewitness to it. They were very impressive testimonies. Then a plumber testified that he had been in Hochman's attic in 1934 for the landlord, and there were no floorboards missing. 1934, 2 years after the crime, no floorboards missing. There was a volunteer handwriting expert, a 67-year-old who had 40 years experience, a guy called John Trendley, and he spoke expertly and passionately that Bruno did not write any of the ransom letter. So it took 6 weeks to end the trial. There was 1.5 million words and 380 exhibits. The prosecution's summary was described as a poisonous distortion. Fisher, the other lawyer of the defense, wanted to do the defense summation, but Riley wanted it because he was grandstanding. Bruno did not know of the New Jersey house of the Lindberghs. He didn't know the family schedule. He didn't know anything about physical evidence. There was none. They believed that the latter was a diversion. It was not really used. It was a diversion to create the idea that somebody came from the outside, that this crime was an inside job. The dog didn't bark. Violet died at her own hand later. Why? Condon's story was full of holes and deceptions and inconsistencies, and his entire history is just crazy. Lindbergh was deaf. His whole story about hearing John in the graveyard, his family later said he was deaf. He couldn't have heard it. No one in court knew about him being deaf, and it would have destroyed his credibility. The handwriting experts were wrong. The accounting, supposedly the budget that the Treasury guy came up with, was a fantasy. The floorboard thing was a fake. The timesheets were misplaced and lost. And it was said that they want to hang this man to cover up our sins. They predicted that there'd be a deathbed confession likely in the years to come, the decades to come, from the real killer. The prosecution summary was called one of the most distasteful on record. It described Bruno as having ice in his veins. He forsook his own mother and ran away from Germany. That he was an animal. And I feel itchy around him, the prosecuting lawyer said. Other prosecutors are appalled by this when at the time and even now when they read the transcripts. An attorney must be fair, and he must do an analysis of the evidence and not a critique of how the guy makes him itchy. No prosecution to tell the jury that I know this defendant is guilty. You should not use inflammatory statements. You're supposed to lean on the evidence. These were incendiary arguments. They were calculated to arouse emotion. They didn't use reason and logic, but the judge let it all go. The defense never objected to any of it. The death of the Lindbergh baby will shrink by comparison to the crime that would be committed if he were freed, Riley said. He then accused Bruno of crushing the child and choking him, and in his own bedroom, the baby's bedroom. And there's no testimony about any of this during the trial, and certainly no evidence. Then the lawyer Riley said, life means nothing to him. He's either a filthy, vile snake or entitled to acquittal. You would never forgive yourselves if you acquitted him. You must convict him of murder. The eyewitnesses reported the judge's instructions to the jury followed the letter of the law, but were delivered to carry a message. Convict him. About the evidence, the judge said, do you really believe that evidence? And it looks one way, but it sounded another. His delivery said it all. The judge told the jury that they had to stay in the room until they would arrive at a verdict. Even if they stayed all day and all night, they couldn't come out until they came to a verdict. The crowd outside said that the jury could hear the crowd yelling, kill Hoffman. The verdict came at 10:30 p.m. that he was guilty. The judge said death in 5 weeks at the state prison. Chapter 28, The Elusive Clemency for Hauptmann. Eleanor Roosevelt weighed in on this. I thought this was really interesting. This is what she said. The entire trial has left me with a question in my mind. Clarence Darrow said that no man should be executed on such flimsy evidence, and the New York Times called the case an unsolved mystery. None of this mattered a jot. What did matter was the appeal, and that would cost $20,000, and that was $20,000 more than Hauptmann had. Couldn't afford it. There were cameras in his cell. He said, I want to tell the people of America that I am absolutely innocent of murder. His mother told the New York Times, I know my son is not guilty, but the Lindberghs wanted it, so everything went that way. She even wrote to Roosevelt. Bruno was put on death row. The lawyer Fisher got the execution postponed on appeal. The German-American population held meetings to raise money to have an appeal because they had no money. They got money from over 5,000 people. Riley billed him $25,000. Anna fired him. The assistant stayed. But Bruno was pauperized by this whole thing. The assistants didn't even submit a bill. They said we're in it for the love of the cause. They petitioned to void the verdict because the trial had a circus atmosphere. The jury didn't really get sequestered because of the crowds and stuff screaming, and that the press was grossly prejudicial. All of it was rejected. The appeals court was a much more dignified event. No mob. The defense argued violations of the 14th and 6th Amendment, that if anything happened at all that he was involved in, it was not first degree, it would have been an accident, that all the witnesses were unreliable. Lindbergh was always in court the bereaved father. It was prejudicial. A.G. Willent said he wasn't sorry that he called Bruno an animal. The judge's decision would come after the summer. So Bruno was asked to write an autobiography for the trial for the money so he could pay his lawyers. The Bar Association was critical of both sides. They said it was a public show. And Bruno wrote a letter to his wife, which was very sad. I won't go into it. October 9th of 1935, the appeals court rejected the appeal. Chapter 29, Governor Hoffman intervenes. Why did the appeals judges think the witnesses placing Bruno not at the scene of the crime or at the scene of the ransom, why did they think they were lying? By chance, the witnesses all had German backgrounds, and the prosecution witnesses were all true blue Americans. So they were more believable, according to these very prejudiced people. There was a strong sentiment of nationalism between the world wars, and they were probably blinded by Lindbergh's fame, and they needed revenge on his behalf. In comes New Jersey Governor Hoffman. He had the power to commute the sentence to a life sentence. He was friends with the warden, and he got the okay to talk to Bruno. Hoffman had been born in New Jersey from a long line of people that came to the United States before the Revolution. He was 39 years old. He had known Attorney General Willents as a child. They were not friends. So this was like a personal thing, too. He'd been a journalist since he was 12. He enlisted in 1917, fought at Verdun. He was a captain. After the war, he worked in a bank. He was a Republican in politics. He ran against Willents for many different offices. And he became the governor during the trial, and he was disturbed by it. Quote, I have never more in my life seen more hatred shown to a man than at that trial. Ellis Parker, the chief Burlington County detective, came and told him that he believed that Bruno was not guilty. Charles Curtis, former vice president, called from Washington, D.C., and told him, funny things are going on about that case. Bruno was not adequately represented. They didn't get a fair deal. Look into it. So the governor did. He knew that a meeting with Bruno would be a political risk because the public had such a level of outrage and emotion about all of this against Bruno. But he took Ellis Parker's German-speaking secretary. They went to the prison. He was expecting Bruno to confess and beg for mercy, and that is absolutely not what he found. Bruno said to him, "Why does your state do to me all this, Governor?" Bruno burst out as Hoffman sat on his bed in his cell. "Why do they want my life for something somebody else have done?" "Because," replied Hoffman, "he'd been found guilty." "Lies, lies, lies," came the response. "All lies. Would I kill a baby? I am a man. Would I build that ladder? I am a carpenter." I just think it's the best line. So the governor listened to him for over an hour, where Bruno outlined the terrible post-case situation and all the evidence, and the governor said, "The poor child has been kidnapped and murdered, so somebody must die for it." Bruno said, "For is the parent not the great flyer," meaning Lindbergh, "and if somebody does not die for the death of the child, then always the police will be monkeys. So I am the one who is picked out to die." He requested a lie detector for him and for Condon, and if he tells the truth, referring to Condon, "I'll be a free man." It's very naive. There was no test. And the question is, then they didn't want the truth. So Hoffman suggested the governor suggested that the members of the Court of Appeals all go to visit Bruno, but they didn't. Fisher, the attorney, and Ellis Parker, the detective, were both convinced of his innocence because a reporter got his information wrong and made the headline, "Lindbergh's Case Reopened." This renewed attention. Hoffman, in public, said that Bruno insisted that he was innocent. Those at risk from a new investigation started to panic because the governor and a top detective, they were a true threat. Anne and Lindbergh fled to Europe. Remember, they all disappeared. Within a couple of weeks of this headline that the case was reopened, Elizabeth Morrow and her daughter went on a world cruise. Condon went to Panama. Dwight Morrow Jr. became mentally stable and returned to graduate school. The public reaction to all of this was hostile. They said Hoffman was an interfering busybody. The governor was accused of publicity seeking, but he put his career on a line for the truth to aid a foreigner with no benefit for him. The Supreme Court refused to hear the case, and the new execution date was set for January 13th, 1936. The Court of Pardons was not likely to consider clemency. The execution date was set again for the 17th. The executioner was paid $150 and his assistant got $50. The New York Daily Mirror serialized Bruno's memoirs so that there'd be some money for his wife. In them, he forgave the Attorney General Willents. He said, "I feel so," this is Bruno talking about the Attorney General, "I feel sorry for him for the language he used. It only reflects a picture of his soul." The Mirror had hoped for a confession, didn't get one. This extraordinary document, talking about the serialized autobiography, this is an extraordinary document for someone who's probably the most cold-blooded and crafty crime on record. The court heard Bruno's mother, the prosecution and defense attorney, and a minister who talked with Bruno. who said, I had 15 very intimate and soul-searching interviews with him and convinced that he tells the truth. If he had had reliable defense lawyers from the outstart, if he had asked for an interpreter, the very evidence against him would have spoken in his favor. But he didn't know about that until it was too late. After careful study of the case, I've come to the conclusion that Anna and his wife and the evidence all say he does not fit the frame of the evidence. I bring these findings to your honorable members to the Court of Pardons, not because of sympathy for him, although I claim to know him better than anyone with the exception of his wife, but I want to see justice prevail. I would ask for the supreme penalty if Bruno were guilty. My creed, this is the minister, has no objections to that. There's nothing else in my mind than this, that I may serve the state of New Jersey with my findings. I feel it is a sacred duty I have to discharge. He was ignored. Where am I? Oh, here we go. So, only Governor Hoffman voted for clemency. The lawyers were still trying to get habeas corpus, but they were denied. Meanwhile, Hoffman's investigation, the governor's investigation, got evidence that cast lasting doubt on the prosecution. Inconsistencies in testimony, bad witnesses, blind ones, lying ones, deaf ones. Too many major figures had fled the country and could not be reinvestigated. They discovered that Bruno had been offered $90,000 for his wife if he would confess for publication after the execution, and he refused. Hoffman and Willens decided to ask Anna to get a full confession, and they would recommend commutation. She exploded at them and said, no, that would make my husband think that I doubted his innocence. So Hoffman managed to get Bruno a stay of about 2 months, but that was it. Chapter 30, an undelivered letter. Bruno wrote a letter to his mother, fearing that it would negatively affect German perception of American justice. It was kept undelivered by the head of the prison. It was discovered after his death, 42 years after his death. The letter included shoes taken by law enforcement that proved that the footprint evidence had been faked, and there were no fingerprints of anyone. They were just not, there just weren't any. And he said in his letter, so they invented the story that I was there and I wore gloves. They faked a chisel that was found, but it didn't match any of his brand that he had. He had a set, totally different set. So that is actually the end of the book. It ends with just the whole thing kind of still hanging. You know, he was executed, and his wife lived a very long life, protesting his innocence to the very end. And even when the author went back to the home county and back to the police department where a crime report would have been made and back to the mental hospital, he was chased out of town on a rail and threatened, basically. Things were still hidden from him. People were still hostile and refusing to cooperate. So money talks. So I really strongly recommend that you check in on the channeling that DEBBRA LUPIEN did. We got information from Lindbergh and his wife and Condon and the son. Just quite a collection of information. It was fascinating. So I hope you enjoyed that. And if you have another little kind of unsolved mystery, true crime thing you'd like me to read about, let me know the book. And thank you very much. Slongafoil, Slancha.